In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to apply a hot coat of epoxy resin to your board. I'm going to be applying my hot coat to the bottom side of my board first for no particular reason. You could just as easily start with the top. Just like the previous fiberglass laminating step, I'm going to be taping around my rails. The location of the tape is slightly different, however. As you can see, I'm taping onto the side rail material just slightly, which leaves the excess tape hanging off the board. The purpose of this is so that when I flip the board over and the epoxy resin starts to spill off the sides, any drips will remain on the masking tape and not on the other side of the board, which would just need to be sanded off. So this step saves time and dust. There's a few best practices to help ensure your hot coat goes on evenly that we should discuss first. It's during this hot coat step when some people run into trouble with bubbles surfacing, so I'm stirring thoroughly but not too aggressively so as not to incorporate air into the liquid resin. The second concept that's often overlooked is the temperature of the room and your board during this step. Remember, I said in the last video that once the epoxy and hardener are mixed, they begin heating up due to a chemical reaction. Well, if your board is not sealed fully already, the epoxy is going to heat up the wood deck, which will actually create a slight off-gassing effect from the wood. That expansion from the heated up wood can cause these tiny pinhole-sized bubbles that come to the surface of your epoxy during the curing process, and it leaves you with these little micro pore bumps that are really annoying. A key to avoiding these pinholes beyond gentle mixing practices is to start with a board that is preheated, in a sense, and apply the resin as the temperature is dropping. This can be accomplished by adjusting your heating or cooling system if you have one, and if you don't and maybe you're working in an outdoor garage workshop, try to do this hot coating in the afternoon or the evening as the environmental temperature begins to drop. Another tip is if you've been touching your board with your bare hands and you haven't been using gloves after your fiberglassing step, you may have transferred some oils onto the board, which is going to repel the resin slightly, and it's going to create this fisheye effect potentially. It's not a bad idea to wipe down your board with a clean rag soaked in some denatured alcohol or even distilled vinegar before applying this hot coat. And last thing to have ready, you're going to be using a chip brush to cover your board with a thicker coat of epoxy this time instead of a squeegee or a plastic spreader. You just want to make sure that you're starting with a clean brush and you remove any of those loose bristles with your vacuum or the sticky side of a piece of tape. Okay, now that your environment is ready, it's time to pour your mixed epoxy over the center of your board just like we did in the last step. I'm using 24 ounces again to ensure a nice full coat. Start by pushing this puddle of epoxy lengthwise with your chip brush across the surface of your board. Longer vertical strokes in the beginning help distribute the material around the board, and then you can use horizontal cross strokes to ensure a nice, even, and full fill. There is a possibility that you can overbrush your hot coat, especially if you're working in a hot environment and you're nearing the point when the epoxy starts to gel. So I wouldn't recommend brushing over the board a bunch of times to smooth out every imperfection, because the epoxy does have a slight self-leveling effect too. Just make sure to fully cover your board as well as the side rails, and keep in mind that because your side rails are more vertical, they may not hold as much resin at first, so you want to make sure to give the sides a little more attention with your brushing. Once your hot coat has been applied, you want to walk away from your board in a clean environment that's free of dust or bugs flying around that might land on your board. And because you're not cutting fiberglass with a razor blade for your hot coat, you can let the board fully cure before going around the perimeter to remove your tape. You'll notice that the tape has created a nice clean line on the side rail material that distinguishes between the side that has the hot coat and the side that has only been fiberglass so far. Now, when you go to flip your board over and tape off the rails again, you will apply your tape as close to that line as you can manage without going over it. Once you apply your hot coat for the remaining side and it spills over the rails, you'll be left with just this slight protrusion of the epoxy where the two pieces of tape met. that can easily be sanded off with a quick buzz of an orbital sander. Once you're ready, get a clean chip brush ready to go and begin adding your hot coat to the top side just as you did before. After everything is cured, if you notice those tiny little bubbles that I talked about earlier forming as the epoxy starts to cure, don't freak out and try popping them all with a heat gun or a torch or more brush strokes. Trust me, that will likely just make matters worse. My recommendation is to lightly sand these bumps down after it's fully cured with some fine sandpaper on an orbital sander, wipe down the board with a damp rag soaked in denatured alcohol, and apply another skim coat of epoxy. Sometimes these bubbles are so tiny and are so close to the surface that you can skip that extra skim coat by lightly sanding the bubbles down, and the varnish that we apply at the end will cover them up. And that's going to be it for this hot coating step. Next, we'll be cutting our fiberglass away from our plastic parts and attaching our handle.